Father Abib al-Naqadi and the Lost Egyptian Treasure. Al-Jabtana, I. The writer of these lines met Father Abib al-Naqadi in the mid-1940s as a teacher and mentor. Father Abib was a pioneer among a group of intellectuals in Mansura at the time. Mr. Abdel Shahid Sadiq Banoob, who later became Pope Theophilus. Mr. Judat, the father of poet Saleh Judat. Mr. Bahgat, the principal of Talca Secondary School. Mr. Selim Anton, a lawyer. Mr. Mahmoud Al-Alfi, the director of Mansura Teachers College. Mr. Ali Mahmoud Taha, the poet and engineer at Mansura Municipality. Khawaja Basili Abdu, one of the major landowners in Raydania. Engineer Muhammad Abu Ria Ibrahim, a railway engineer who was sent several times to England and was as encyclopedically knowledgeable as Father Abib. Mr. Mahmoud Sanan, deputy public prosecutor, and others. Father Abib resided in an old house next to the church of Raydania. However, he spent most of his time with my father Ali al-Alfi, the mayor of Raydania, as Father Abib had no family to care for him. Everyone often gathered on Thursdays in Mansura at a private apartment, joined by a large group of intellectuals and music enthusiasts, including Naji during his time in Mansura and Saleh Judat on occasion, among others. Father Abib was the eldest among them, being, according to his account, born in the late 1860s. All acknowledged his mastery, not only due to his age, but also because he was the most cultured. He was fluent in many languages and an avid reader of any book, journal, or newspaper he could get his hands on. I was like a son to Father Abib. During my primary and secondary school years, I read under his guidance most of the books in his library, which housed an astonishing mix of works. An English edition of Charles Darwin's On the Origin of Species, alongside a book titled The Refutation of the Origin of Species, translated by Shibli Shumail, authored by Father Georges Farag Sagir, a Maronite. The book bore a dedication from the Lebanese priest to Father Abib. Collections of Shakespearean plays, English translations of works by Molière, Racine, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau. English translations of German writings attributed to Karl Marx, including the German Ideology and other works by Hegel and German authors. Poetry collections by Abu al-Ala al-Ma'ari, al-Mutanabi, and others. Pre-Islamic literature by Dr. Taha Hussein, Islam and the Fundamentals of Governance by Ali Abdel Razik, and most Arabic and English dictionaries. Numerous copies of the Quran, some of them handwritten gifts from Sudanese acquaintances who occasionally addressed Father Abib as Caliph. Several Arabic and English editions of the Bible. Al-Sanhuri's The Intermediary, numerous books on constitutional and international law, and a majority of history books written in Arabic and English. After reading a book from his library about Neoplatonism, Plotinus of Alexandria, and Alexandria's influence on the philosophy of Thomas Aquinas, I posed several questions. He responded, I am a Hellenistic case. I am a Coptic Egyptian from Naqada. My mother, Catherine, was from a Greek family that lived in Mansura. To satisfy your curiosity, I will add that I was raised as a deacon in a church in Upper Egypt, where my family ran a small restaurant at a railway station. I traveled to Greece, Italy, the Levant, Sudan, and Montenegro in Yugoslavia, working in various jobs and mastering numerous languages. My favorite languages to read are Arabic, English, and Coptic, Demotic. I served in churches in South Sudan, Ethiopia, and Uganda. After settling down, I served in some Upper Egyptian churches. During that time, I established strong connections with Egyptian, English, American, Dutch, and German archaeologists. I assisted them in hiring laborers, translating for them, and introducing them to some Coptic families who preserved certain secrets and treasures. Among these archaeologists were prominent figures such as James, Henry Breasted, his student John Wilson, Kamal Pasha, Sami Gabra Pasha, Salim Hassan, Khairi Pasha, and Mokhtar Pasha, among others. I admired his remarkable memory, which remained sharp even before his death in the late 1950s at the age of 90+. He memorized most of the poetry of al-Mutanabi, Abu al-Ala, Ibn al-Rumi, John Keats, Shelley, Byron, Milton, and Wordsworth. He also knew Fitzgerald's translation of Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam and al-Sibai's Arabic translation of the Rubaiyat. In his conversations, he could summarize and comment on Don Quixote, Ibsen's A Doll's House, Ferdowsi's Shahnameh, theological dialogues between Christian sects and New Protestant thought. He was also well-versed in Islamic thought and fair in his assessment of the Mu'tazila, Shia, and some Kharijites. Father Abib al-Naqadi memorized the text of the Jabtana, known as the Egyptian books of Genesis. He often mentioned that the Egyptian historian Manetho of Sebennytos authored 2 works. 1. Egyptiaca, the well-known text frequently cited by later historians as a reference for determining the ruling dynasties of ancient Egypt. Large portions of this text have survived. 2. Egyptiana, a lesser-known work, deeply rooted in Egyptian heritage. It gives the impression that Hebrew and Semitic thought drew heavily from it, a point it explicitly asserts. Father Abib pronounced the second text in its Coptic name, the Jabtana, a sacred text or sorda. The term sorda is an ancient Egyptian word adopted into Semitic languages with the same sacred meaning. The word and its derivatives are evident in terms like surah, chapter in Arabic, and in Semitic contexts, sorda or surah is akin to sefer, book. Dr. Louis Awad's linguistic studies highlight the interchangeability of F and W. The Jabtana narrates the story of the emergence of deities in Egypt, the unification of the Egyptian people along the Nile Valley, and the beginnings of Egyptian civilization. The cultivation of grains, the creation of farming tools, the domestication of animals, the reclamation of swamps for agriculture. It continues to chronicle Egypt's cultural roots up to the death of the human Osiris and his transformation into a divine figure, the collapse of the first unification and the initiation of the second unification under Narmer-Menes. Manetho regarded the Jabtana as a sacred text passed down from priests who inherited it from their ancestors. He emphasized its sanctity by recounting a vision where the Lord of Lords instructed him to rewrite the Jabtana from ancient texts engraved on tablets, ostraca, and tomb walls. He complied, believing the text to be divinely inspired or ancient scriptures recorded by early Egyptians. The Jabtana was preserved by priests, recited in temples, and portions of it were used in liturgies. When Christianity became established in Egypt after the Age of Martyrs, those clinging to ancient beliefs faced persecution. They retreated into deserts and mountain caves, reciting the Jabtana as a sacred text that connected them to their faith. With the advent of Islam and the Arabic language in Egypt, Egyptians grew concerned for their language and its associated heritage. The Jabtana resurfaced as a sacred text linked to Coptic identity, akin to how Western Christian councils integrated Aristotle into Western Christian thought. Thus, the Jabtana continued to be recited during Coptic festivals and celebrations and was used by some teaching monks to train students in writing and reading up until the end of the Fatimid era in Egypt. Father Abib and his legacy. Father Abib memorized the Jabtana entirely, as it had been passed down through 55 generations, he claimed. He recited it in Coptic, a language dear to him and in which he was considered an expert. Foreign translators of Egyptian scripts occasionally sought his assistance. He translated what he recited into Arabic for us. I memorized the general outline of the events, several chapters, and wrote down much of it. While a student at Dar al-Ulum in the 1950s, I began compiling and writing the complete text of the Jabtana. I showed several notebooks to Father Abib, who approved them. I structured the text into 16 books, each containing 5 chapters, according to his recollection. Father Abib passed away in the summer of 1959. After graduating from Dar al-Ulum, I restructured the text based on my notebooks and his under the guidance of Bishop Theophilus Abd al-Shahid Sadiq Banub. Later, I collaborated with lawyers Emil Doss and Nassif Boutros, who generously provided all available works on the ancient and pre-dynastic eras in Arabic and English. They were generally familiar with the Jabtana through an elderly Copt from Beba in Beni Suef. I found that the Beba residence account aligned closely with Father Abib's version, though the latter was more precise and coherent. I rewrote the Jabtana several times, reviewing ancient history, my notes, and those of Father Abib, alongside references from classical authors such as Hecataeus of Miletus, 550 BCE, Herodotus, 450 BCE, Hecataeus of Abdera, 300 BCE, Manetho of Sebennytos, 270 BCE, Diodorus Siculus, 60 BCE, Strabo, 27 CE, Josephus, 37 CE, Plutarch, 120 CE, among others. Finally, I completed this version of the Jabtana on the 7th of Hathor, 1705 Coptic calendar, corresponding to the 16th of November, 1988 CE. Egypt and Religions. Introduction to Anthropology and Social Psychology. Many have doubted the profound thoughts attributed to Helen Keller, the deaf-blind woman. They believe that what has been ascribed to her is merely the thought of her speaking companion. The skeptic's argument is based on the idea that the human brain, which works with limited symbols, can only produce a limited, simplistic type of thought. The broader the brain's capacity to handle a greater variety of symbols, the more complex, intricate, and profound the mental processes become. This might explain why geniuses have never emerged from the deaf, while a large number of blind geniuses have appeared. Before the Paleolithic era, human animals lived in small groups like other animals, thus relying on gestures and using very few vocal symbols. This resulted in a limitation of mental processes, as they were like the mute, unable to use many symbols. In this context, it is worth mentioning an incident experienced by some anthropologists. A British scientific expedition found a small, isolated island near the Christmas Islands in the Pacific, between northern Australia and Southeast Asia, in the early 19th century. On this island, they discovered humans still living in a Paleolithic-like state. They were extremely primitive, mostly communicating with gestures and uttering only a limited number of words: tree, water, turtle, fish. They knew only the numbers 1 and 2, and if they wanted 3, they would say 1 and 2. If they wanted 4, they would say 2 and 2, and so on. They also had no names or any form of belief. In the Paleolithic period, the ancestors of the Egyptian race lived in the green steppes that later became the deserts we now call the Eastern and Western deserts. These early Egyptians lived like animal herds, using gestures like the mute and uttering a few sounds. The strongest and most dominant male in these groups would expel the weaker, younger males once they grew up and began showing sexual behavior, which Freud considered the root of the Oedipus complex. Similarly, the stronger females would expel the younger females once they reached maturity and began exhibiting sexual interest in the adult males, creating the Electra complex. The young males and females would then flee from the adults but remained in the area, driven by a longing for the cave they came from and an innate desire for the protection of the group. Thus, new generations would form, fight, and mate, creating the clan. The desertification increases, hunting decreases. Battles erupt between tribes competing for survival. The tribes become more cohesive and interlinked, and some tribes begin marking their faces for identification, a practice that often involved scratching the faces with bird claws. Matters grow more complicated, the number of linguistic symbols increases, the mind becomes more active, and life progresses. A new, drier era comes, the drought intensifies, and some tribes move toward the Nile's benefits: water, greenery, game, and fruits. These tribes were initially afraid to approach the Nile because of the numerous predators lurking there, as well as mysterious legends about destructive creatures like the Sphinx and animal-headed deities. Despite these fears, some tribes moved toward the Nile's resources, driven by the instinct for survival. In this dense, jungle-like environment along the Nile, these groups needed to use sounds for communication, as gestures and signals were no longer enough. They invented vocal calls for differentiation, identification, and distress, typically using two-syllable sounds like Jibtu or Nilo. And so the Nintilo and Gebto tribes advanced and settled along the banks of the Nile. As desertification and drought increased in the eastern and western steppes, new tribes arrived at the Nile's benefits. These new tribes clashed with the older ones, but eventually they merged, and the environment's challenges, land, jungle, water, animals, humans, led to further cooperation, understanding, and war. This drove the growth of language and thought. Leaders and rulers emerged, along with politicians, administrators, and warriors. Totemism appeared in the clans, represented by tree trunks or stone pillars, which ancestors leaned on. These totems turned into deities, and those who represented them became priests, the men of God. The ancient Egyptians, like all humans, rejected death and annihilation. As their minds progressed during the Neolithic era, they believed in a supreme, eternal creator God. For this eternal creator gave them everlasting life, as they believed he could resurrect them in the afterlife. As the Egyptians' language and thought developed further, they began to think about intangibles and aesthetics. They looked at the clear sky and its blue dome, which the sun traveled across from morning to evening, only to return again, ushering in a new day. They looked at the sky at night, and it was equally magnificent, studded with the jewels of stars, adorned with a glowing moon that began as a crescent, then became full, and then returned to a crescent, starting a new cycle. The Egyptians observed this celestial beauty and believed that the eternal, supreme creator must have his glory in the heavens. Just as earthly rulers have thrones, the Supreme One must also have a throne in the heavens, and the earthly rulers have attendants and assistants. Therefore, the Supreme One in the heavens must have a pantheon of gods or angels, and these beings must have wings. The idea of the pantheon of angels and helpers passed from Egyptian thought to Semitic thought, along with the concept of wings for the gods and angels. Egypt's theological thought. Egypt's intellectual development in theology gave rise to a new concept in the Egyptian heart, conscience. This conscience urged people toward good, while reprimanding and chastising them when they considered evil. Gradually, the Egyptians transferred their ethical, customary, and legal principles from being mere cultural constructs built upon a base structure into sacred theological principles. Eventually, these principles were inscribed as divine sacred texts, written by Thoth, the god of wisdom, on tablets to be followed by every individual living in Egypt. Through the myth of Isis and Osiris, the Egyptians portrayed the struggle between good and evil, ensuring that good would ultimately triumph. Likewise, in the myth of the Gebtana, transmitted by Manetho of Sebennytos, they created enduring theological concepts that were later adopted by Hebrew and Semitic theology. The emergence of divine entities, the afterlife, reward and punishment, heaven and hell. Paradise, literally meaning house of grace, and Gehenna, meaning valley of punishment. These terms were directly derived from Egyptian thought. Similarly, Satan and its roots in the Osirian story, and Osiris itself, also known as Osir-El, which means Azrael in Hebrew thought, bear testimony to this Egyptian influence. Ammon in Egyptian thought became Amen, a word uttered universally by humans. Nebo, meaning blessed or holy, also shares roots with Hebrew expressions like Gabriel, the angel of God. The word Heli, meaning light or glory, used in Egyptian hymns, later turned into Hallelujah in Hebrew, and this can still be heard in modern Egyptian Christian liturgies. The Hebrew influence of Egyptian theology is widely acknowledged by historians, evidenced in the Old Testament. Moses was educated in all the wisdom of the Egyptians and was powerful in speech and action. Acts 7 verse 22. Solomon's wisdom surpassed the wisdom of all the people of the East, Kings 4:30. Over time, the priests' efforts increased and the cost of embalming rituals and funerary items escalated. The rituals became more elaborate with higher prices for coffin texts, as well as small statues, shubashi, placed in large quantities in tombs to pray for the deceased. These shubashi are still referenced in Egyptian dialect as shobsh. There were also symbolic doors through which the soul would enter to interact with the body, and masks that guided the soul's journey. The priests developed the idea of statues resembling the deceased, placed in front of tables with offerings for the spirit of the deceased, which led to the institution of endowments to support these offerings and protect the graves. These changes led to an upheaval in Egypt's social and economic systems, and then came Christianity. The Egyptian Copts entered this new faith, speaking the same Egyptian language. Despite their scriptures being written in Greek letters, they continued reading and speaking the Egyptian language, believing that their cultural identity, their totem, was tied to it. With the arrival of Islam came the Arabic language, and Egyptian resistance to this new language began. As Egyptians embraced Islam, the Arabic language took over, while the Egyptian language retreated into the churches and among Coptic families, continuing until the Fatimid era. Even so, Copts still recited the Gebtana as a sacred text, linking them to their ancient history. When Napoleon arrived in Egypt, he thought about reviving the Egyptian, Coptic language so that Egypt could be part of the Mediterranean world, like France, Italy, or Greece. However, his attempt failed because languages, much like religions, infiltrate people's minds and consciences through various factors such as habit, interest, and societal pressures. The succession of religions in Egypt has taught the Egyptians tolerance, as they learned that there are many paths to God. The minister of King Saladin was a Coptic Egyptian, just as Joseph the Hebrew served as minister to the king. Historians note that Copts Christians borrowed carpets and candlesticks from mosques during their feasts, and Muslims borrowed the same from churches during their own holidays. 3 religious processions would gather on the Nile in Cairo during the delayed flooding, led by the Sultan, the Caliph, the chief judge, the Sheikh of Al-Azhar, the priests of the Egyptian church, and the Jewish rabbis, followed by bearers of the sacred books of the 3 religions. The prayers were chanted and performed in the 3 languages, with everyone supplicating to God in the names of the 3 foreign prophets to bring the Nile flood and prosperity to the land. James Henry Breasted and many scholars of civilizations assert that Egypt is the creator of the conscience of the civilized world, and that Egyptian texts are the root of Hebrew and Semitic scriptures. Among the most definitive conclusions of historians is that the wisdom of the Egyptian sage Ptahhotep is the origin of the Psalms, just as the wisdom of Amenemop is the source of the Book of Proverbs. When the Ottoman Empire weakened and became the sick man of Europe, it tried to sow division between Egyptian Muslims and Coptic Christians. A law was enacted by Humayun Pasha, restricting construction, renovation, and the addition of bells to churches. However, the Egyptians thwarted the Ottomans' efforts to sow discord. The Humayun decree and the official script became subjects of mockery and chaos among the Egyptian masses. Egypt is the one that introduced the concepts of eternal life, resurrection, and immortality into the Semitic Hebrew thought. In the earliest books of the Old Testament, the expression of hope for the tribe's continued existence is portrayed in an organic, primitive way, much like in ant or bee colonies, without any regard for an afterlife. This can be seen in verses like, "But you shall go to your ancestors in peace and be buried at a good old age." Genesis 15. Honor your father and mother as the Lord your God has commanded you, so that you may live long and that it may go well with you in the land the Lord your God is giving you. Deuteronomy 5, verse 16. If you walk in my ways and keep my statutes and commandments, as your father David walked, I will lengthen your days. 1 Kings 14. What happens to humans also happens to animals. The same fate awaits them both. As one dies, so dies the other. All have the same breath. Humans have no advantage over animals. Everything is meaningless. Ecclesiastes 3:19. These texts show that the early Old Testament does not refer to an afterlife, judgment, or concepts of heaven and hell. With continued interaction between the Hebrews and Egyptian thought, the Hebrews began to embrace the concepts of resurrection and immortality. The first clear reference to resurrection is found in the book of Daniel 12:2. Multitudes who sleep in the dust of the earth will awake, some to everlasting life, others to shame and everlasting contempt. Notably, the term many is used, not all, indicating a gradual development of these ideas. The Hebrews, initially more focused on animalistic, instinctive survival, started adopting the Egyptian perspective, which had already conceptualized resurrection in a moral and ethical manner. Joseph Wood Crutch, in his book The Modern Man and His Mood, explains this shift in human thought. The desire for life after this one is universal. It is a protest or objection to the laws of nature, which do not consider human aspirations and goals. From this analysis, it becomes clear that tribes closer to a primitive, instinct-driven life, like the Hebrews, initially focused on the survival of the species. In contrast, Advanced civilizations like Egypt connected immortality to higher moral values, such as sacrifice for the children or the nation, thus linking the belief in resurrection to these higher ethical ideals. In this context, a question arises: does Eastern religious philosophy differ from Western religious philosophy? And what impact does this have on epistemology and on the progress of the West and the stagnation of the East? The answer lies in the fact that Eastern philosophy was concerned with blending God and the world, seeing the world as divine and the movements of nature as divinely ordained. Consequently, there was no need to ask why, because the answer was always that God willed it. In contrast, the Western mindset, based on Greek critical reasoning, separated nature from God and made it subject to its own laws. Thus, the Western response to questions like, why does the apple fall, is the discovery of the law of gravity. Salama Musa, in his book Freedom of Thought, offers a similar answer. The Greeks were the first people to develop a scientific approach for two reasons. First, they did not integrate God into the world, believing that the world was ancient and that even the gods could not always achieve their desires. Second, their religion was not turned into law, always keeping a separation between religion and law. The phrase, "render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's and to God the things that are God's," reflects this Greek-Roman separation. In conclusion, Egypt was the dawn of the conscience of the world and the center of intellectual and cultural exchange. No nation before it can claim this distinction. It was in its temples that the first sacred texts were formulated, which were later adopted by the Hebrew and Semitic texts. To Egypt came Abraham, Jacob, and the tribes, and Moses grew up along its Nile shores, learning in its temples. Even his name, Moses, derives from the Egyptian language, meaning son or child, as seen in names like Thutmose, child of Thoth, the god of wisdom, or Ramses, Ra's child. The Holy Family, Mary, the child Jesus, and Joseph fled to Egypt, where the Imam al-Shafi'i, whose teachings are followed by a significant portion of the Muslim world, also lived and was buried. Egypt continues to be a key center of thought and culture. The Gebtana and the neglect of Demotic and Coptic treasures by archaeologists. Gebtana is a text that includes the Egyptian books of creation, compiled by Manetho of Samanud in 270 BC. Copies of it were originally written in Demotic and later in Coptic. Father Abib al-Naqadi, a monk in the Radania monastery near Mansura, had the Gebtana memorized and would recite it to his students and followers, translating it into Arabic. Classical historians mention that Manetho had two major texts, the first, Egyptiaca, which is the history of the Egyptian dynasties and pharaohs, and the second, Gebtana, which Manetho compiled from temple records about the Egyptian books of creation. It could also have been a popular religious chronicle of the Egyptian people. Father Abib compared the Gebtana to the Shahnameh of Ferdowsi and the Old Testament, often insisting that the Hebrews borrowed the first parts of the Gebtana in the books of Moses and the early Old Testament, while they later wove their own history based on the later parts of the Gebtana. The text of Egyptiaca, the history of the dynasties and pharaohs, became well known because classical historians relied on it. However, the Gebtana, the Egyptian books of creation, was ignored by classical writers because it did not discuss the ruling dynasties or kings, and ancient history was mainly concerned with rulers and monarchs. Moreover, the Jewish control of the ancient Library of Alexandria deliberately ignored the Gebtana to prevent scholars from accessing the text from which the Torah was derived. Father Abib often praised Professor James Henry Breasted, sharing his belief that the Hebrews had stolen Egyptian ideas and attributed them to their prophets. He also criticized Professor John Wilson, a student of Breasted, who supported the superstitious beliefs of American evangelicals who believed in the return of Christ from the Promised Land and supported Israeli Jews, while obscuring any evidence that showed the Hebrews had borrowed from Egyptian or Babylonian Assyrian thought. Hegel, Marx, and Isaiah Berlin divided civilization into a lower structure, the material base of civilization, including agriculture, industry, tools, and production relationships. This material base gives rise to a higher structure of cultural, legal, and religious institutions suited to the lower structure. Father Abib often quoted this division, emphasizing that the material base of ancient Egyptian society produced the higher structure of laws, religion, and culture. In contrast, the Hebrew shepherds, who frequently visited Egypt, took from it the higher structure, particularly religion and law. Since the Hebrews did not have a material base that could enforce laws and religions, their leaders attributed religion and laws to divine powers in order to impose them on their tribes. Thus, the Hebrew belief in the one Egyptian God was a fragile belief that they soon abandoned after Moses' departure, as the Samaritan led them back to the worship of the golden calf, which was a totemic practice for shepherds. Father Abib was fluent in many languages, including Demotic and Coptic, and worked for a long time in Central Europe, particularly in the regions of Montenegro and Bosnia-Herzegovina. He visited many parts of the world and its museums, and he often emphasized that there were mounds of Egyptian papyri, particularly Demotic and Coptic, in museums worldwide. He also noted that most of these papyri, especially the Coptic ones, had been ignored and forgotten, especially those that might reveal that the Jewish heritage had burdened Egyptian heritage and had borrowed much from it. Another issue was the difficulty in reading and understanding Demotic and Coptic. Since the 26th dynasty, the late period, beginning with Pharaoh Psamtik, and during the reign of Pharaoh Necho, Greek and Hurrian, European or Northern influence began to seep into Egypt through mercenary soldiers, prisoners, and captives involved in shipbuilding and other labor. Later, Alexander the Great's campaign and the reign of his Ptolemaic successors furthered this influence, as did the Romans. During this time, Egyptian life declined, and Egyptian texts began to be written in the vernacular, Demotic. As often happens during periods of decline, and scribes from the priestly class deliberately made texts more difficult to understand in order to keep their priestly, magical, and medical knowledge secret from outsiders. Father Abib recounted how he faced difficulty in understanding a text found in a jar in the ruins of Beni Hassan in the early 1940s. The text remained mysterious for a long time until Father Abib deciphered it. He discovered that the ancient writer intentionally placed the letter S, sigma, in place of the first letter of each word, and then added an extra word after the original word starting with the letter S. For example, sent means rabbit, Sist means milk, Sana means cumin, Sakam means fennel, Samun-Ra means Amun-Ra. Thus, the phrase could be translated as, "You are not a priest serving Amun-Ra, you are a priest of Naos." Perhaps priest of Naos meant a charlatan. Father Abib wondered, is this the language of the Sim or Sin? He thought so. Given such difficulties, coupled with deliberate neglect, many Demotic and Coptic texts were never translated, despite their presence in museums around the world. Professor Salim Hassan, in the 1950s edition of his book on Egyptian civilization, stated, 100 years passed since the publication of the first Greek papyrus found in Egypt, and we had to wait until 1941 for some Demotic and Coptic papyri to be translated. Many papyri in the British Museum, the Philadelphia Museum, and others remain unread. Salim Hassan praised the efforts of scholars such as Birch, Geraft Rex Spielberg, and Herbert Thompson for their attempts to translate these papyri. Father Abib took immense pride in the Gebtana, presenting it to lovers of Egyptian and human heritage, and to those seeking a scientific understanding of the true nature of religious texts. He often referred to the comparisons made by James Henry Breasted between Egyptian texts and the Old Testament, demonstrating how the Semitic sacred texts drew significant inspiration from Egyptian ones. He also pointed out that Semitic texts adopted the same ancient Egyptian word for text or sacred scripture, surta. This term evolved in Semitic languages into sefer, surah, and swara, as seen in Hebrew, Arabic, and Aramaic traditions. Albert Schweitzer, in his introduction to the English edition of the Philosophy of Civilization, highlighted Egypt's pivotal role in advancing the authority of conscience and morality in ancient world cultures. He noted that while the human desire for power and domination is instinctive, Egyptian religious philosophy influenced Semitic and Hebrew thought, balancing the logic of power with moral principles. Interestingly, little attention has been given to what al-Masudi, 896 to 957 AD, a scholar, historian, geographer, traveler, and pioneer of the theory of hereditary deviation, often referred to as the Herodotus of the Arabs, mentioned in his Meadows of Gold and Mines of Gems. In the section on ancient history, he described widely known texts among the Copts, both Christian and Muslim inhabitants of Egypt, that recounted the history of ancient Egypt, its temples, monuments, religions, and sacred scriptures. Father Abib spent his entire life devoted to and defending the Gebtana, considering it the pinnacle of Egyptian civilization in its higher structures. He was consistently aware of forces opposing the dissemination of the Gebtana, aiming to protect the prestige of Hebrew and Semitic texts that most people held sacred. The Gebtana contained far more detailed accounts of ancient Egyptian history than those found in the works of classical historians like Plutarch. One of the striking statements often quoted by Salama Musa was, "Our current weakness leads to the loss of our intellectual treasures. Nations, like individuals in times of weakness, fail to remove the rust from their jewels. Even if they manage to polish them, they may be unable to present them to others who, in their superiority, become arrogant and disdainful." Excavating the mounds of Demotic and Coptic papyri in museums around the world could uncover astonishing Egyptian treasures. Revealing such treasures, including the Gebtana, could restore our confidence in ourselves and inspire a belief that this nation deserves a better life and genuine freedom, thereby setting things right.